think we're recording. I guess we are. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Cinnamon Stitches. I am not your yarn host, Jennifer. I'm Mr. Cinnamon. Jennifer and I wanted to allow me to make a video and put it on here for the world to see. This is a different video. This isn't a video about yarn or crochet or knit or yarny things and yarny stuff. Rather, this is a video about a tribute to my grandma. So I know Jen made a video, and I'm generally the kind of person where I keep quiet. I make sure everybody else is okay and before I kind of really say anything. And so one of the things I came to realize is today, if this is Friday, which Jen controls when videos go up, but if this is Friday, today is the funeral for my grandmother. We didn't go out. We made the decision not to go out for the funeral. And it took me a lot of soul searching to make that decision. But because I realized I would want to talk about my grandma and say the things that, I think people want to know about her, but I would be talking to a group of people who already know her, who knew her, who loved her as much as we did, and who probably miss her as much as we do. But one of the things that my grandmother had told me so before I get into that, so if you're looking for yarny content on your Friday, there's not any here, so I certainly understand if you turn this off and move on. But if you decide to stay, then you get to hear and learn about my grandma and what she means to me and us. Because if I was there, I would tell these things to the people there, but I'm choosing to tell them to you. For us, my grandmother was a big part of our lives, and when we had went out for my grandfather's funeral a few years ago, one of the things that my grandmother said when she pulled me aside and she talked to me, she reminded me, funerals are for the living. And I realized it when one evening when I went off by myself and I sat and I thought about whether we were going to go or not. And I remembered she said that. And I remembered we went out to California for the funeral for my grandfather, for my grandma. So we went out there to be with her, to show her that we loved her, that we loved him, and that we were all still here for her. And that's why we went. Then I realized those words that she had said to me then kind of rang through true in my head when I realized she's gone. The person, I would say one of my best friends growing up, she's not there anymore. So going out there, I didn't think it was necessary. And plus telling, my stories of my grandma to folks who already know, at the end of the day, it was more important for me to spend time with my family and realize that kind of stuff. So that's what we did. So today is her funeral, and everybody's remembering her in their own way. And this is my way of eulogizing, memorializing, paying tribute to a woman who meant so much to us in our lives and to me. Growing up, my mom and my dad didn't have a whole lot of money, so oftentimes we were on welfare or things like that. But there was always a rock within our lives, and that was my grandma and grandpa, my mom's parents. And me and my older brother used to go spend weekends there. We'd get dropped off on Friday, come home on Sunday. My grandparents would take us to Disneyland every once in a while. You know, they would come and visit on Christmas Eve and deliver presents like Santa Claus, and just those kind of things that as a kid, you know, you always knew that if you went to Grandma and Grandpa's house, it was a safe place to be. Dealing with all the things that my parents had to deal with, it was one of those things that I don't know if sometimes they wanted to get us out of the house for issues or things that were going on, but at the end of the day, we got to experience spending time with my grandparents and my grandma and my grandpa. Over years, you know, I think I always had a really close relationship with my grandma. I was never one who viewed it as, ew, grandma and grandpa, or, you know, whatever. It was more like I enjoyed going to their house. I enjoyed spending time with them and things like that. Even as kids, you know, even as we grew up and we became, you know, preteens and stuff like that, we would go spend time over there. And it's funny, one of the stories I tell Jen every so often, I remember, is I spent the night at my grandma's house on the night before my 13th birthday. And my grandma had this, one of the guest rooms had a trundle bed. Those aren't familiar with it. It's like a bed that has like a bed under it that you pull out. And I remember that room also had like a full-length mirror on the closet in there and everything. And I remember I spent the night, and I stayed up all night till midnight to stare at myself in the mirror, wondering if I was going to change when I became a teenager. Nothing changed overnight anyway, but I remember that because that mirror was still in her house, and I think it's still there today. And that room looked very much similar to the way it did when I was 12 years old. And I remember the next day, you know, my grandma made me German chocolate cake, and anytime, you know, she made me German chocolate cake for my birthday. And it was one of those things that I always remembered, because it was a safe place, it was a happy place, it was a memorable place for us, you know. My grandma's house changed over time, and, you know, sometimes I got a little frustrated by that, because change meant things were getting different, and I didn't like it, and grandma's house always felt like it wasn't meant to change. Obviously I got used to all the things that would change at her house and stuff like that, but we actually ended up moving into her neighborhood as teenagers, and it was kind of neat because I got to see her like every day or whenever I wanted to, because I would literally just walk through the neighborhood to go to her house. And there were days I would walk, you know, as I was going to friends' houses or whatever, I would stop by her house and go in and sit down with her and just kind of sit at the table, have a sandwich, and talk. And we would do that. You know, we'd just sit there and talk for hours. You know, in many ways, my grandma kind of became my best friend as a teenager, because she was like somebody I could talk to about anything that I wanted to. And, you know, I mean, there were so many times where, you know, like, you know, my friends would go off and we would do things that we shouldn't be doing, getting in trouble. And I'd say, hey, I'm going to go by my grandma's house, you know, while you guys go do whatever. And I would go to my grandma's house. And next thing you know, friends of mine would get arrested or something like an hour later. And it's like, no, I was at my grandma's house safe and sound, not getting arrested. You know, but those were times that, you know, I wouldn't ever give up, you know, having been able to get closer to her as we lived in that neighborhood. And I know, you know, for me, my grandma was like, I had grown up where there was a consistency with them. You know, there was a consistency in, you know, things not changing. And for a kid who grew up with, you know, parents who got divorced, you know, when we were young, and who fought all the time, or, you know, having to move from place to place, or, you know, having to move in the middle of the night so the landlord didn't know. It was that kind of thing that, when there was a consistency in my grandma's house, it felt good. So as a teenager, I would still stay the night over there. Even though I lived in the neighborhood, I would still spend the night over there and just kind of hang out. We would go Christmas shopping together. I always enjoyed going Christmas shopping, not because my grandma bought me stuff, but because I just liked hanging out with her and going and doing stuff. And her and I would, you know, we thought it was neat. You know, we would get Christmas wrapping paper, and after Christmas shopping was always fun, and things like that with my grandma was just fun. I used to go every Christmas and help her wrap Christmas presents. It was our thing. She had a cool setup with, wrapping paper, like a wrapping station in her office room, and she would leave packages for me to, I'd stop over in the middle of the evening or something, and I'd go in her room and just wrap presents or decorate them or whatever, and we would do that together, and it was always really neat and really fun to do. I remember there was a period of time for a couple of years where I was not home. I was in a boys' home for a couple of years, and when I would come home on the weekends, it was always nice to see my grandma and my other aunt, my aunt. I didn't really go to my mom's house when I would come home, but I always knew grandma's house was a place to go. So for me, growing up, grandma's house was like a beacon, the place that if I just looked in the direction of grandma's house, it was home. Her phone number, she'd had the same phone number forever, and even today to right now, that number was always her phone number, and I knew everybody knew it by heart. We knew we could call it whenever she needed. There were so many times where we kind of, there were so many awkward moments with grandma, as we grew up. This is a story. If she was alive, she probably wouldn't. She wouldn't like me saying it, but I remember one time, me and my cousin, we spent the weekend there, and we didn't sleep, and we heard sounds coming out of Grandma and Grandpa's bedroom. Needless to say, we're like, oh, Grandma and Grandpa. But hey, they loved each other, and there's so many things like that, like 5 years. My cousin was 5 or 6, and I was probably 7, and I remember us trying to stay up all night long, to the point where we were in the garage playing pool, just trying to stay up, and then my grandma woke us up first thing in the morning as we're laying on the garage floor because we couldn't make it, but. And then always, those were the kind of things that were always really funny, is I'm sure she got a kick out of that kind of stuff, finding her 2 grandkids on the garage floor. But I always loved when she would go to the commissary or go on base, and I got to go with them. I loved going on base with them. She'd always involve us in things, like when she was doing special events at the post office, because she worked for the post office, and she was doing special things. She would, like when they opened up a new post office, we got to go help set up and raise the flag and do all that kind of stuff. It was really neat. So there's always these experiences that surrounded my grandparents. As I got older, my grandma took on a role of confidant, somebody I could talk to about stuff. Finding a job, when I was 13, 14 years old, my grandma gave me all the tips and pointers on resumes and filling things out. She drove me to some job interviews because I didn't have a car, and she gave me a lot of kind of way forward and how to navigate that. And then as I started working, helped me navigate the finances of, budgeting and paychecks and taxes and all that kind of stuff. To this day, I think she was still getting the Kiplinger magazine, if any of you are familiar with that. She always had financial advice for us. And we always listened. I always listened. I still remember when, my mom was a single mom for a long time, trying to raise 4 kids on welfare, or when she wasn't on welfare, when she had a job, when she, while she worked, trying to deal with, making too much money for welfare, but not making enough money to really get by. It was just, those were the times that, we lived really close to my grandma, and so we were able to go visit all the time and just kind of relax when we were at her house. As I got closer to, I dealt with a lot of issues as a teenager, and my grandma kind of knew, but I think in some ways she didn't know all of the ins and outs of it until I really kind of became an adult. And then as I graduated high school, Um, I remember, they came to my graduation and, obviously congratulated me and all that kind of stuff. But it was kind of at that moment she realized there was like so many different aspects of my life that weren't right. Whether it was things with my mom or just things with getting in trouble with the law or whatever it was. And she knew it, but she also was the kind of person where my grandparents knew that they could give you a helping hand in terms of helping you with advice and information and knowledge, but not a handout. They both believed that it was important for you to be able to stand on your own, and be able to survive on your own, but obviously with some pointers, if you will, from those who knew something, and then the ultimate decision was on your own. I think for me the hardest part was coming to the realization as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old that I needed to leave California. I felt like I was, as a middle kid in my house, I kind of felt ignored, and I felt like invisible to those around me. And I think my grandma saw it, and my grandma kind of understood. And I had went to her house one night and I talked to her about it. I talked about wanting to potentially leave and kind of make my own way, figure out what I'm going to do with my life. And I remember it was just before Christmas, and I went on a shopping trip with her and my grandpa. We went to the outlets and they were doing some Christmas shopping, and I always used to love going with them. And they were in a store called London Fog, and I remember this. And they were looking at winter coats for a cousin or something like that, is what she told me. And she's like, "Hey, come here, you're about as tall as him." I was a skinny, taller kid then. So mind you, this is a long time ago. So I went over and I tried on the winter coat and was like, "Yeah, it looks good and looks fit." She's like, "Oh, okay, thanks," and didn't say anything of it. So I remember it was probably between Halloween and Thanksgiving, and I remember she called me and asked me to come to her house. And again, we're in the neighborhood, so I went over to her house and we had dinner or whatever, and then afterwards I went in the other room just to kind of hang out and watch TV or whatever, and then she called me into the dining room, and she said, "Hey, come here." So I went in the dining room, and she said, "Hey, I wanted to give you an early Christmas present." In the box was a winter coat and a bus ticket out of California. It was, so I knew somebody in Iowa, so it was a bus ticket to Iowa. It was a one-way ticket. It wasn't a round trip. And, obviously, I thanked her. I hugged her. I didn't realize how profound of a moment that was. But I remember the bus left just before Christmas. So it was literally like weeks away. And the day I left, the day before I left, I had went around to everybody's house, everybody that I knew, all of my friends and all of my cousins and family, to say goodbye, in a way hoping somebody would tell me not to go. My mom didn't tell me not to go. I don't even think she asked me why I was leaving. And that's not a knock on my mom. But I remember my grandparents and my mom drove me to the bus station. And I had one of those pagers that you could get words on at the time. And for those of you who don't know, a pager, we're too young to know, which I know there's some of you on here are pretty young. Think of it like a cell phone where the only thing they can do is send you a code on a device that tells you to call them back from a payphone or a phone you're near. But I had one, and I remember that I had told her, but hey, if you need something, just page me. And I held on to that thing literally just before I stepped onto the bus, hoping somebody would tell me not to go. I remember my grandma gave me a really big hug, She told me to be safe and to make sure I let them know everything was fine. And my grandpa, who was a retired, I believe he was a retired senior chief. I thought he was master chief, but I believe he was a retired senior chief from the Navy. For me, he was always like a gruff old man, because he had been through so much, but he was just ready to just retire and just live. He still worked for the Navy as a civilian, but in any event, I remember he hugged me, and that was something I had never experienced with my grandpa. And then, obviously, my mom hugged me and said goodbye, and again, never asked why I was leaving. Got on the bus, and I left. I was sad. I didn't understand, and again, it was years before it really kind of dawned on me what all of that meant. I made it, stopped in Iowa for about a month or so, and then ended up making my way over to Michigan, where I met Jennifer. And we met within. Let's see, I got there in January, and we met in March. So it was pretty quick that we met. But in any event, I kept telling everybody I was home. I made it. Everything was fine. And my grandma obviously worried, wanted to make sure I was good, and I was. And I remember that first year was hard, being away from everybody and everything that I had ever known. I was living with friends in Michigan, so I wasn't like totally alone, but these are friends that let's just say we did a lot of bad stuff as teenagers, and so these are friends that I trusted them, and we all trusted each other with our lives, but they were the kind of friends that you would also get in trouble with, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing. I love them, but obviously I recognize that now. And then after me and Jen met, we dated, and then by the end of summer we were like ready to like move in together. And I remember we moved into an apartment, and when the holidays came around, it was really hard because I had wanted to go home to visit, and I just didn't have the money. I couldn't. And Jen, Jen was there for me. And but I remember we kind of made it a point that we'll get back there at some point. And my grandma, I remember that Christmas. My grandma was always trying to find ways to ship Christmas presents, in such a fashion that she could ship a lot of presents to folks, and that wouldn't be a ton of money. And I remember she shipped, she got like one of the big plastic bins, and she filled it with Christmas presents. It was like towels and other really cool stuff too. And she put it in a plastic bin, and she zip tied it closed and everything. She shipped it via Greyhound. So I don't know if you still can, but you used to be able to ship stuff, like bulky stuff, via Greyhound. So I remember going to the bus station and getting this big old plastic bin filled with gifts. And it was awesome. And, so even then, my grandma still wanted to make sure that we had the things that we needed. We finally did make it home in 2001, literally days after 9/11, when all the air traffic was still shut down. We were on the Greyhound because I didn't fly, so we were on the Greyhound back to California. And I remember I didn't know about it, but yeah, I remember going home, hugging everybody, and it was nice to see everybody again, old friends welcoming me back, things like that. But every visit until my grandma got sick, we'd stay at her house. That was home. When I talked about going home, it was going to grandma's house. And again, that's not a dig on my mom. My mom moved around some, and so just nothing felt like home like grandma's house did. And so we would always stay there and stay in the guest room and things like that while we were there. Even when we had our daughter, when we had Juju, we would do that. But I remember after years later, Jen told me my grandma pulled her aside and had said, I don't know if it was that visit or maybe a later visit, but she had pulled her aside and said, don't ever let him move back. And her view was that, if I had moved back, I would just get pulled into all the trouble and all the things that had always existed when I was gone. Mind you, I grew up in an area that was gangs and drugs and graffiti and, all the ways you can think of to get in trouble. And those are the kinds of crowds that I ran in. And so she recognized that there was really nothing there for me and I was better off away. She was right. And she was right, absolutely. And I didn't think about that. And when Jen first told me, she said, I was like, oh, okay, whatever. But there came a point where, after I think, and I've loved Jen from the first moment I met her. But there came a point when my daughter was born where the realization hit me that home was not Grandma's house. Home was with my family. It didn't mean Grandma's house wouldn't feel like home. It just meant that my home was where Jen and the kids were, or Juju at the time. But Grandma's house was still served a purpose to me in my life, that it was always a place that I could go to that reminded me of home. Even, and I always wanted to bring my family to. As the years went by, we made a number of visits out there and made some great memories, like, going and visiting with Juju, when she was just 18, I think she was 18 months old, and we flew, and I was like, I'll never fly again. But we flew, and by the way, I apologize. Like, it's hard for me to talk about this stuff and look at the camera, because then I feel awkward. So if you're kind of distracted by that, I apologize. But we flew, and then we went to Disneyland, and Juliana loved it, to the point where the very next morning we're sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast, and here she comes with just a diaper on and a t-shirt and some Mickey ears and her little backpack, and she wants to go back to Disneyland. And she kept saying, Disneyland, Disneyland. And we're just laughing at the table because it was just so funny. But, we continued to build memories, and I got to cherish the fact that Jen was building memories with my grandparents that I got to build. Juju was building memories with my grandparents and my grandma. So they got to see, like, what I thought was so awesome about them. And I think for us, when we decided, we were going to get married before Juju was born, it was a no-brainer for us to get married out in California. My grandparents, insisted we had the rehearsal dinner at their house. And it was just one of those things where, and then my grandpa brought out some alcohol, and I had never had a drink with my grandpa, so that was kind of neat. But it was one of those things where, I got to share these experiences with my grandma and with my family, and those. And it was like every time we would go visit, she would always make dinner. We would always let her know what day we would be there, and she would always have dinner ready when we got there. And it was always either like her chicken or rice, that is like my favorite meal, or my grandpa's goulash, which was like my second favorite meal, or something else. And it was always, that's the way that it worked. And she always came out the front door and stood in the yard and waved to us when we pulled in, and that's where she was when we left, standing in the yard waving to us as we left. And those are, those were always the moments, and just, in sitting for hours and just talking to her, and having Jen and them talk to her. And, the time, after she had been diagnosed with cancer and she had been getting some hormone treatments and things like that. And I remember we were out there visiting one time, and she needed to get a hormone shot, or a steroid shot. Sorry, steroid, not hormones, but a steroid shot. And we drove her, Jen, and Juju drove her. And Juju was, I'm going to say probably, I want to say 10, maybe 7 or 8. We drove her, and she got her shot, and then it just kind of got her wound up and wired. And later that evening, it was pretty funny. It was like midnight, and we're all still up talking at the kitchen table, and Juju's sitting there, and Grandma's like, "You want a pineapple upside down cake?" And Juju's like, "Yeah." So Grandma literally made a pineapple upside down cake at midnight. That is the best pineapple upside down cake I ever had in my life. But yeah, I mean, over time, you know, even after she got cancer, you know, she never struggled. She never let on that she was having a hard time. She continued to be this consistent presence in our lives, this consistent force in our lives. We talked fairly regularly, and one thing you can always count on, if you were talking to Grandma, she had a notepad next to her, and she was always taking notes. She would always remember something, and Christmas time, birthdays, you'd get something that you had mentioned back in January, and you'd get it in December, you know, those kind of things. But she was always so observant, and she was always patient. When I had the opportunity, so I had always, growing up, I had always saw my grandpa, you know, my grandpa had been in the military, he still worked for the Navy. My grandma worked for the post office. Everybody in my family basically worked in the post office. So I kind of always had this wanting to serve thing. You know, I had wanted to go into the Air Force. That didn't really pan out. And then, you know, I wanted to do something with my life. I didn't know what. And then obviously we moved. And then over time, you know, an opportunity arose for me to accept a job in D.C., and, you know, I called my grandparents and I was like, "Hey, you know, they offered me a job. I'd be working out at the Pentagon. You know, I'm not sure I can take it." And I explained to my grandma, I said, "Unfortunately, you know, I don't have the money to move, you know, me and Juju and Jen to DC, get a place to stay, have a place to put our stuff, you know, even just to lay our head for a month. I just didn't have it, because it was literally like $4,000 to be able to even just do that for a month, even though I knew I'd have a paycheck coming." And I was very reluctant, but I was like, I have no other person that I can ask. I asked my grandma. My grandma didn't say no, which I thought for sure she would have. But my grandma said, "You have to ask your grandpa." That was probably the worst thing I had ever heard, because at that moment I was like, nope, it's not happening. I'm going to have to turn down this job, because I can't take the job. Hang on, the battery's about to die. Okay, so I'm back. So she said I had to ask my grandpa. That was really hard. And I remember Grandpa got on the phone, and I said, "Hey, Grandpa, I got offered a job with the government. I'll be working at the Pentagon." I said, "I'm really excited about the opportunity. I've always wanted to, you know, serve." I said, "But the only problem I have is that, you know, I don't have enough money to make the move to bring the family and do all that stuff." I said, "And if I can't come up with the money, you know, and if I don't know that I'm going to have the money, I'm going to have to turn down the job." He didn't say no. He paused for a second, and he said, "How much do you need?" And, you know, I'm sitting here, I'm like, okay, I'm going to scrounge up as much as I can. If I can scrounge up a couple grand, then I only need like $2,000. So I told him, I was like, I think I can come up with just like, you know, $2,000. So I only need like $2,000. And my grandpa stopped, and he's all, "How about 5?" He's like, "I can give you $5,000. And you just pay it back over time." I was like, "Yeah, you know, I appreciate it. You know, I'm happy. You know, I love it. You know, I appreciate it." And so, you know, they sent me the money, and we were able to, you know, do our thing and move out to Virginia, and, you know, I was able to start my job. Okay, I'm back again. Something keeps happening. But there came a point where I was walking, in that first week, I was walking in the Pentagon. And I remember the floors are like spotless, like marble floors, and I remember the sound of dress shoes, the clap, 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 as people walk through. And I stopped. Probably looked weird to many people, but I stopped. I kind of closed my eyes, and I like realized that this is what I had wanted for a long time. And I opened my eyes, and I kind of turned around, and I looked, and I was standing right in front of the CB. There's like a special wall dedicated to the CBs, and I just happened to be in front of it, and my grandpa was a retired CB. So it was like meant to be, you know, and so, you know, we were meant to be here, and my grandparents made that happen. You know, when I graduated college in Michigan, they were there for my graduation. You know, my grandma and I talked a lot over the last, 10, 12 years that we've been out this way, and everything from my job to how to navigate, the, federal system, and how to navigate careers and saving, and when we were buying our house, and issues with the kids, and finally when Lucas was born, and being able to have them meet him and see him and visit them, and the relationship that Jen and my grandma built, and the relationship that Juju and my grandfather built. All of these things were because of my grandma. She was this constant in my life that pushed me along, that was there, and when I was sitting deciding whether or not to go to the funeral, I sat there and I realized the trajectory of my life would have been so vastly different had she not been in it. I could pinpoint spots along my life where she or my grandfather, she or the two of them, had intervened in some way, maybe small, maybe minor, but it pushed me along. The leaving California, knowing that she wasn't going to see her grandson every day and all the time like we had. The asking Jen to not let me come back. Coming out there for my graduation, lending us the money to move. The constant connection between her and them. The communication of, funerals are for the living. All these little things, they were something. Whether it was advice that I took, whether it was something they did, but at all these points along my life, things could have went vastly different. Things could have went a way that I wouldn't even know. And for that, it's, when I think of who my grandmother was, my grandma was my best friend. So I'm glad she's with my grandpa again. I'm glad she doesn't have to deal with the cancer anymore. I will miss her. But I know everything she taught me, everything she's ever said to me, will continue to impact my life and my children's lives for the rest of our lives. Some aspect of her will always remain inside of me. So there's a lot more I probably could have talked about. But I really just wanted you to kind of have a little bit of a glimpse of who my grandmother was and what she meant to me. So while, today may be a day where people say goodbye to her, I don't need to, because she's always with me. And she always will be. She's with me when I look at the pictures of her. Every day when I go to work, she's with me as a constant reminder of them moving me along. Every day I walk in the door at home, and my home is with my family here in Virginia and not in California, is a reminder that she's with us. So at the end of the day, it's never goodbye. And for my grandma, I will always love her. I will always think of her. And there will be days where I have to ask myself, what would grandma say? So, but in any event, if you stayed this long, thank you for listening. Whoever you are and wherever you are, just know that, we live our lives and we never may not look back and realize just how impactful others have been in our lives. And just know that I know to Jennifer, each and every one of you is important to her. She's said it to me in multiple occasions. And even my grandma always got a kick out of, every so often checking out Jen's channel. So anyway, for now, goodbye. Thank you all for listening.